So good morning dear students. Our topic for the day is Ecocriticism, and we know that it is one of the rather recent developments in the area of literary criticism and theory. Regarding the movement of Ecocriticism, I hope that you are all familiar with some of the recent developments in it, in the sense that we are living in the 21st century where a kind of an ecological awareness has crept into our lives, especially in relation to the various disasters which the world has seen in the last 10-15 years, like the tsunami, like the various explosions happening here and there, the landslides in Kerala, the flood, and all these things in essence might have been one of the sources for the creation of a kind of an idea about nature in the minds of people. Anyway, let us come to the topic specifically. Actually, the term ecocriticism, which is written here, is a term that was coined in 1978, well before the actual origin of the theory, by a theorist known as William Rueckert, R-U-E-C-K-E-R-T. So William Rueckert, in his rather very famous book, Literature and Ecology. And when he was using this term, he never anticipated the fact that it is going to be one of the terms with which we are going to measure literature in the next 10-15 years. But then, in the 1990s, if we move to a kind of a history of eco-criticism, we can have certain landmark names. Actually, the very famous book by Cheryl Glotfelty was published in 1992 with the title Ecocriticism Reader. Actually, any reader, it's a collection of essays on the theme of ecology, environment and literature. And incidentally, as a definition of ecocriticism, Glotfelty says that it is the relationship between literature and the physical environment. So, one of the very recent interdisciplinary, or one of the recent examples of what could be known as interdisciplinarity. So a branch of knowledge which takes into consideration two very significant aspects of our contemporary lives, literature as well as ecology. And that is the way Glotfelty defined it, but then still, it's not because of the book Ecocriticism Reader in America, or the publication of the book Ecocriticism Reader in America, that the movement got its steam or its power. Rather because of various historical and cultural reasons that it got a very important place in the last 2-3 decades. Like what happened in Chernobyl, like what happened in Bhopal, the infamous Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. And in our very city of Calicut, we have witnessed the protests of people against the way the waters of Chaliar is polluted by companies like Gwalior Rayons. So all these things are part and parcel of a kind of an economic awareness, coupled with certain very important books like The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in Malayalam, what we call Nishabda Vasantham. So it's a kind of a book which could be described as the Bible of ecocriticism, in the sense that a book which opened the eyes of the very, what could be described as the very capitalist, consumerist American society, where Carson was dealing with the impact of, the impact of what could be described as the excessive use of things like DDT and other chemicals. So it is in such a context that ecocriticism was the track for a kind of a critical school like ecocriticism was set by these various changes happening in the world in the last 50-60 years. Now we come to the specific point. In 1992, the year 1992 is a very significant year, in the sense that an organization was founded in America with the name Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. It is, its abbreviation is ASLE. So, Association for the Study of Literature and Environment in 1992, and in the next year, the very famous Journal of ASIL for the study of literature and environment began, ISIL, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, in 1993. The year 1993 also is very important. So, this is a kind of, a very brief history. For the students of literature, for us, what is really the most difficult thing is to pinpoint a starting point for something. We don't have an exact starting point to what could be described as structuralism or what could be described as post-structuralism, because people like Derrida or people like Saussure, they are people who doubt all origins. And we are in a world without origins, and we are in a world without end. So, anyway, academically, for theoretic purpose, if you need a starting point, this could be, the ASIL and ISIL in 1992-93 is actually, the backbone of the discipline to be emerging in the next 20 years. So, that is a very rough beginning of what could be called eco-criticism. Then, eco-criticism is an American term. It has a corresponding British term, the Green Studies. And we have again the prestigious book, The Green Studies Reader, edited by Lawrence Coupe, C-O-U-P-E, published in the year 2000. So the Green Studies Reader, because the British people are more fond of literary images and the green, and we often identify green with so many things, but in a context of eco-criticism, green stands for actually this particular color of nature. So that is about the very starting point of it. Then another British thinker who contributed a lot to this discipline, one of the most significant thinkers of the contemporary phase of theory, is none other than Jonathan Bate, B-A-T-E, whose book Romantic Ecology, published in 1991, remember the year 1991, even before the publication of the Eco-Criticism Reader, was actually one of the landmarks in this event. And what he was identifying in the book is a kind of a transition in literary criticism from red to green. And you know that historically red stands for the monopoly or hegemony of Marxism, and green stands for eco-criticism. So from red to green indicates a new phase in the history of literature studies, in the history of the study of literature, in the sense that it is time for us to proceed from the terminologies of Marxism to something which affects us more seriously, especially in the context of the year 1989-1991, where we are disillusioned over the ideology of communism, or over the practice of communism rather than the ideology of communism. The point is that the collapse of Soviet Union, the unification of Germany, etc. Are certain landmark historic events with which we finally concluded that this world has entered a new phase, the neoliberal phase. Now how, what is known as eco-centeredness or ecological is related to these historical events? This is a really very important question. Now let me come to another aspect of it, or we come to the most important aspect of eco-criticism. The interrelationship of literature and environment can be understood only in relation to certain very seminal concepts. And one of the most important ideas that we have, terms which are quite familiar to us, like symbiosis, the interconnectedness of all forms of life. So symbiosis means the interconnectedness of all forms of life. This is an idea, in a sense, anticipated by people like Chief Seattle almost or more than 150 years ago. So, theorizing it, we have come to a kind of a stage where we emphasize something like symbiosis, that is the interconnectedness of all these different aspects of life. Now, this is the most important aspect of the theory of eco-criticism. Now, if we come to the second important aspect of it, we have a philosophical name there, what is known as deep ecology. Deep ecology is a philosophy of the 1970s and 1980s, where in America there exists a kind of a profound distrust over the so-called values of American materialist culture. So many similar movements, like the hippie movement, like the Beat generation, and in the 1960s there was a kind of an orientation towards Eastern spirituality in America, and this is a kind of, more or less, it is a kind of a spiritual movement founded by the Norwegian philosopher Arnes. The name again is very important. Arnes and the American Bill DeWaal. It's a countercultural movement, a kind of a movement which is against the very basis of what we often see as the most important values of the American consumerist culture or the materialist culture. When we think of deep ecology, we know that deep ecology is the opposite of shallow ecology. And so, what is shallow ecology? Shallow ecology is a kind of a perspective where we are, in superfluous terms, we are thinking of nature, or we say that if you do something like this, for instance, if you cut down the trees, nature will be affected. This is shallow ecology. On the other hand, deep ecology is a much more profound and philosophical kind of a thinking where the most important idea, I'm not going into all the various aspects of deep ecology in such a short span of time, but the central aspect of deep ecology is that deep ecology basically believes that all forms of life have an intrinsic value, and this intrinsic value is not fixed by you and me. We basically believe that certain animals are useful to us. A cow is an animal which is useful to me because it gives us milk. We say that goats are good because, again, they are of use to us. We say that a dog is basically one of the best friends of, dogs are the best friends of human beings, no issues. So these are certain animals whom we consider our friends, or whom we consider more useful than some other animals. Okay. But what about a rat? What about a snake? In our common perspective, we don't assign any kind of intrinsic value to snake, or if there exists a kind of a value system or a hierarchy, we say that cow is more important than the snake, or a cow is more important than the rat. So this is the way that we make a kind of gradation over certain things, or to put it very shortly, in our perspective, certain animals and certain plants are useful to us. We eat certain plants, we consume the fruits of certain plants. So they are useful to us. On the other hand, certain other plants, which we refer to by the term weed, are totally useless to us. So this is the kind of a paradigm that we have. And deep ecology questions this very way of structuring or categorizing the various plants and animals of nature, including the non-living things. For instance, if somebody says that we have no problem in using whatever things for the purpose of house construction or for some other purpose, there's no issues. But deep ecologists challenge it. Deep ecologists would say that the human, the non-human, and everything in the world are equally important to us, and we, the human beings who belong to just one among the many species of the world, are in no way efficient enough to categorize things on the basis of their hierarchical value. And this is actually what the deep ecologists question. Or deep ecology is a kind of a spiritual system in which we have to take into consideration equally the human beings, the animals, the plants, or the human and the non-human world, to put it very simply. The non-human includes not only the living organisms, but also, what we often refer to as the inanimate nature. So it includes the world of stones, the world of, the mineral world, etc., etc. So it's in such a perspective that deep ecology expresses its difference with what is known as shallow ecology. Because in shallow ecology we say that we need to plant more trees, we need to preserve nature, we need to conserve. So this is the way that we often, our discourses are often structured. So, on the day of the Earth Day, we plant trees and we don't, pay attention to the trees from the next day onwards. This happens. So that is something that is known as shallow ecology. But what we need is a kind of a thorough revision of the very basic thinking plans of us, and this is actually what is known as deep ecology. So deep ecology, the term, the supremacy of the term is actually, or it is because of the currency of this philosophy of deep ecology that we have something which is known as eco-criticism emerging in the coming years. So this is the point that I was trying to introduce. Now, there is a basic question as far as eco-criticism is concerned. How is it a theory? Or why is it a theory? Or is it a theory? These are all valid questions. Because one of the primary assumptions of theory itself is the constructedness of reality. We say that reality is linguistically constructed, or we say that gender is socially constructed. So, if we believe in constructionism, if we apply the same thing to nature, nature also is a kind of a construct. Actually, Kate Soper made a rather very polemical statement that it isn't language that has a hole in its ozone layer. A very polemical statement to point out the very irony of what is known as constructionism. Because what Kate Soper is expressing is his anger, his frustration at the very way in which we state that everything is a construct including nature. But nature is something which really exists. That's what he says. The sun is a reality, the moon is a reality, ozone layer is a reality. So how can we say that it's merely a constructed? So it is here, actually, from the point of view of literature studies, two movements which are very severely attacked by the later eco-critics are actually Marxism and psychoanalysis. Because the Marxists would say that what is known as nature is a kind of an instrument through which we mirror the relationships which happen in the world. So nature is something which is secondary in the Marxist discourse. In psychoanalytic criticism, we often use nature and nature-centered images as as symbols for the human heart, or as symbols for the working of the human heart. Anyway, the central point is that in both these systems, nature is backgrounded to a secondary status or to a secondary position. This is a real problem according to the eco-critics, because they say that the earth where we reside is actually a very important place. This is a very important place, and without the earth, we human beings, not only we human beings, but also the non-human world also cannot survive, cannot go on. So the problem lies in our very way of considering nature as merely a kind of a backdrop in our stories, in our novels, in our cinemas, etc., etc. So this is the problem that the eco-critics raise very seriously in relation to the way we consider, the way we structure nature. And actually Lawrence Buell in 1996 wrote a wonderful book called The Environmental Imagination. And in the book The Environmental Imagination, the central idea that is stressed is the way in which the non-human world is included in literature. Is it as a background? Or is it a kind of a narrative in which we have given what is known as the environment a due place there? This is the basic question that Lawrence Buell asked in the book, in the 1996 book. The point is that a text to be ecocentric, or a text to be something that is part of the development of this kind of a rising ecological awareness or an environmental consciousness, actually it should have a kind of a pattern in which nature itself or environment itself seems to be, or environment itself should be the most important value or the most important ideal. So this is the basic thing. This is a basic concept that Lawrence Buell was putting forward, rejecting the so-called superficial theories of what is known as constructionism. Now, when we come to the history of a movement like environmentalism or eco-criticism, what is really very important is how anthropocentric our culture is. And one of the central terms which eco-critics question is that of anthropocentrism. And why should we question anthropocentrism? We believe that this universe is basically created for human beings. For instance, in one of the most important essays on eco-criticism, Lynn White Jr., a Protestant priest, says that I shall give you dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. This is Genesis 1:26. And Lynn White Jr. says that Christianity is one of the most anthropocentric of all religions of the world, and it has got a kind of a perception. In his essay, the title of the essay is The Historical Roots of Our Environmental Destruction, or our ecological destruction, the historical roots of our ecological destruction. And what he says is that religions like Christianity or anthropocentric structures like Christianity is not the only religion which is anthropocentric in nature. Almost all the religions, definitely all the Semitic religions are anthropocentric. So these, this kind of a perception where man is described as the crown of creation, and again, this earth is the fallen world to which human beings were sent to after the, human beings were sent after the first sin or after the original sin. So what Lynn White Jr. says is that there is a kind of a categorical problem as far as the nature is concerned. It is a site to which the punished beings were sent. And paradoxically, over this earth, these punished beings are given supremacy and control. So he says that such discourses, our cultural discourses, are always anthropocentric in nature, and this very anthropocentrism is definitely the main tone of literature. So we have no problem in whale hunting. If you take a text like Moby Dick, we have no problem in killing, in hunting, in our popular imagination, because most of our stories are based on images in which nature is very ruthlessly and mercilessly attacked. Because we have come to a stage in which we understand development as the maximum exploitation of nature. Exploitation is a term which we use often in the context of economics in a positive light, in a positive sense. But the exploitation of nature is considered as the basic or as the starting point of civilization, by clearing large amount of or large areas of forest. Actually, the word area is more important and more significant. Large areas of forest, most of our cities are built. So, we come back to Lynn White Jr. to conclude the point. Religions, their anthropocentric culture, the myths, again the very anthropocentric nature of most of our myths, and it is through these sources that our society has always been constructed as a kind of an anthropocentric kind of a structure. And eco-criticism basically is the rejection of anthropocentrism, because anthropocentrism is human-centeredness. One among the many species of the world considers itself as the most important species, denying rights to all the other species. So what kind of a system is it? What kind of a mechanism is it? Or what kind of a philosophy is it? And it is in such a context, it is in such a cultural context that a new way of looking at literature for the way in which nature, environment, ecology, these are all terms that we use with minor differences. We will come to the specific definition of all these terms. But basically, literature is reinvestigated to see the way in which it includes nature or it fails to do the same. So this is actually the crux of what is known as eco-criticism. So recently, critics would go back to texts written during the classical period to point out how anthropocentric they were, or how they failed to have the so-called environmental imagination of which Lawrence Buell was vehemently talking about. This is the very basic structure on the basis of which one should approach literature right now. It's not only a site for the rereadings of classical texts, but also for the analysis of contemporary texts, where we often speak of rather the modern ways of understanding nature. And as an instance, for instance, let me come to one particular point. That is Jonathan Bate's famous book, Romantic Ecology. And in Romantic Ecology, Jonathan Bate takes one period in the history of English literature which is considered to be the most nature-centric. Undoubtedly, you all know that it is Romanticism. So Romanticism, which is considered as as a kind of a period in which nature lovers became poets. We often would say that Wordsworth is a nature poet, or Wordsworth was a nature poet. So but people like Alan Liu, people like Jonathan Bate, they have come to critically analyze the way the Romantic poets used literature. And in the book Romantic Ecology, Jonathan Bate comes to a wonderful conclusion by reading Wordsworth's famous poem, The Prelude, his autobiography in verse. And he makes a kind of a statement that nature is, for Wordsworth, the very categorization of nature is a bit problematic, because he makes a way of, he was making a kind of classification, a kind of a hierarchical classification of nature. Certain forms of the earth, certain particular forms of the earth can be seen as primarily more important than some other forms. So for instance, the Lake District of England is seen as one of the best places in the world, or the Lake District is nature, whereas the wilderness cannot be considered as nature. So such a problem, or such a dichotomy, such a paradox which exists in Wordsworth is very thoroughly investigated in the book. And Wordsworth, the same Wordsworth who was praising French Revolution in the opening, in the opening sessions of his poem, The Prelude, finally, at the end of his career, resorts to what is known as poetic imagination, just like any other poet, and he says that imagination is the most important thing, ignoring the real nature, or ignoring the real environment. Because he says that earth in the Prelude, Wordsworth often describes the earth as a place where things cannot be changed, whereas in poetic imagination things could be easily changed. So he goes to he takes such a kind of a position where earth, which is considered to be the center of all our action in an ecocentric perspective, is again relegated to a kind of secondary level. And that is why Alan Liu's famous book, Wordsworth, The Sense of History, is basically a kind of a severe attack on one of the most celebrated nature poets of the world. So, I was trying to give you an example for the way in which in eco-critical classes or in eco-critical readings, how the classical poets were evaluated and how their works were reread by people. So at the same time, somebody like Jonathan Bate, in his very prestigious reading of Keats's poem Ode to Autumn, speaks of an alternative kind of an ecosystem, because Ode to Autumn, we often consider the season of autumn as non-glamorous in comparison with spring. So in the music of autumn, in the last stanza of the prestigious poem, he speaks of an inclusive ecosystem where we can see, gnats, crickets, bleating of lambs, all these sounds which are not very pleasant in the context of spring, as constituting the music of autumn. And therefore, Jonathan Bate makes a kind of a reading of Ode to Autumn by stating that Keats's poem is an ecocentric kind of a text, or an environmentally conscious kind of a text, in the sense that it includes the rather ignored aspects of nature, or it brings to the foreground the rather ignored, marginalized aspects of nature. So this is the way that presently eco-critical readings or eco-critical readings of literature take place in different in relation to literature. Now when we come to one final aspect of eco-criticism, this is a term which is quite familiar to you, known as ecofeminism. Ecofeminism, as we all know, is a combination of eco-criticism as well as the various feminist discourses, because both nature and women were traditionally considered as oppressed by men or patriarchy. So therefore, it's a kind of an ism which believes in the in a kind of an equation of the marginality of nature and women, and ecofeminism in its two different aspects, what is known as radical ecofeminism and what is also known as cultural ecofeminism, proceed from this kind of a starting point that both nature and women are equally oppressed. In the cultural aspects of ecofeminism, they take this kind of an equation on a positive note, the equation between nature and women, because both are the producers of the real producers of something in this world, because it is nature and women who give birth to things. So when nature and women give birth to things, men can't give birth to things. That is, to anything. That is the way that something like ecofeminism or the cultural ecofeminists agree upon, and therefore they trace back the various cultural myths, the various traditions where we had the concept of what could be described as a mother goddess, or what could be described as a creative, a woman who functions as the source of all creations, as in some Native American folklores or in some African folklores, were brought back, and we consider such stories as really very important from a methodological value, in the sense that it is through such stories that we can broaden our understanding of the presently patriarchal kind of a world. So radical ecofeminists, on the other hand, they might challenge this kind of an assumption, this kind of a wrong equation, whereas cultural ecofeminists would prolong this kind of an understanding by culturally assembling the various available sources to highlight the relationship between the creativity of earth and the creativity of women. So it is in this line that what is known as ecofeminism makes a rather very strong contribution to the discipline of eco-criticism. So I think that is the end of the session. It's time for you to have to raise your voices of concern.
Sir, can the eco-critical theories formulated by Arnaies and so on be applied to third world countries as well? So
you are asking a very important, or you are raising a very important question in the context of eco-criticism, especially something that is quite relevant to in the Kerala scenario, where we have what is known as the Madhav Gadgil report or the Kasturi Ranjan report. So can we have a universal application of eco-criticism everywhere? This is the sense of your question, if I presume right. Then it is in this context that we have to go back to the concept which Ramachandra Guha, the famous historian, raised years ago. And in the initial stages of his career, where he was an environmentalist, he rather put forward a very important category in eco-criticism, which is known as third world environmentalism or environmental justice. But third world environmentalism or environmental justice is a kind of a concept whereby Ramachandra Guha, alongside with his Spanish companion Juan Martinez Arrier, they were proposing, Ramachandra Guha and Juan Martinez Arrier were proposing a new kind of a paradigm as far as the study of the environment is concerned. We cannot universally apply the same kind of a value system in the first world and in the third world, precisely because values are distributed in the universe, or resources are distributed in a rather unjust way in the world. The first world is really very wealthy, and the third world is really very poor. The first world has its population regulated or controlled, whereas the third world is facing a kind of a population explosion. So you cannot apply the same kind of steps in both the first world and in the third world as far as the question of environmentalism is concerned. We all agree upon the basic premise that the production of carbon dioxide or the production of carbon monoxide or what is known as the helium gases should be contained, no problem. But if we measure it if such a decision is taken at present, who will be the affected parties? Definitely the third world nations are going to suffer more because of it, because the first world is an already developed world, an already progressed world, and therefore the same standards of carbon credit policy can be taken or can be implemented in the other parts of the globe, especially in the third world. It becomes a great injustice, and that is why Ramachandra Guha proposes something that is known as environmental justice. First of all, the resources of the world should be shared equally, or there should be some attempt for the sharing of the resources equally. Then we can have, of course, meaningful discussions, or we can have discussions regarding the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol for something like a zero carbon credit policy, etc. Otherwise, these discussions are going to be really very hazardous, really very harmful to the poor people of the third world. And therefore, that is what the significance of the question lies. It cannot be universally implemented in the same way everywhere. This is about, actually what is known as the policies. But what I was talking in the presentation is about the way in which we are reading literature. And in the very phase of reading literature, there doesn't exist any kind of a major difference between the first world and the third world. In the first world and in the third world, or in our very own world, what we need is a kind of the creation of environmental consciousness through the study of literature. And for that, we need to critique what is known as the anthropomorphic culture. But when it comes to the implementation of policies, definitely we must see it specifically in the context of the third world, and that is where actually our authorities met some very serious resistance from the part of people when they tried to implement a report like the Madhav Gadgil report, which is of course one of the finest drafts as far as the environmental discourses are concerned. But a very fine draft known as the Madhav Gadgil report became a source of problem in a place like Kerala or in the Western Ghats, precisely because of this kind of an inequality that exists in the world as far as the sharing of the resources aspect is concerned. So thank you.